One moment, I was watching a multi-million-dollar deal slip through my fingers. The next, a small voice cut through the tension, a kid's voice, answering a question in flawless Korean. I looked up and saw her standing there, calm as if she'd been doing this her whole life. And she wasn't even on my payroll. The last thing Noah Blake expected that morning was to find himself sitting across from a billionaire CEO while his 10-year-old daughter quietly altered the fate of a $1.5 million deal. At dawn, when the rest of Manhattan was still half asleep, Noah's day had already begun in the polished, glass-lined halls of one of the city's most prestigious tech firms. His mop handle had long ago molded to the shape of his hand, and his shoulders carried the rhythm of a man who had been doing the same job for years without complaint. Noah was a widower, his voice quiet but warm, his presence steady without demanding attention. Sophie, his daughter, was his anchor, the one thing that made the early mornings and aching knees worth it. She often joined him during school breaks, not because she had to, but because she seemed to like being near him, even if it meant waiting for hours in the executive lobby with nothing but her books and a thermos of soup. This morning was no different. Sophie sat cross-legged on one of the firm's sleek leather chairs, the pale winter light spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows and catching the faint strands of gold in her hair. Her oversized headphones rested around her neck, faintly leaking sounds of a language most passers-by couldn't place. It wasn't the first time she'd done this. She had a habit of picking up obscure languages simply because they interested her. One week it might be Icelandic, the next it was Swahili. To the employees bustling past in tailored suits, Noah was invisible. Just the guy with the mop, a background fixture in their world of high-stakes deals and shareholder meetings. He didn't mind. If anything, anonymity was a kind of shield. He glanced over at Sophie. She was bent over her book, lips moving faintly, as if rehearsing sounds to herself. She caught his eye and grinned before returning to her page. He returned the smile, pride swelling in his chest. She saw him not as a janitor, but as something more. The man who made her lunches, taught her how to ride a bike, stayed up late to help her with science projects, and never once let her feel the absence of her mother more than she had to. It was an ordinary Tuesday. Noah was polishing the chrome along the executive floor's reception desk when the mood of the place shifted. A sharp noise broke the usual hush. Raised voices behind the frosted glass of the boardroom, the heavy slam of binders on the table. The calm, professional rhythm of the floor cracked, and something urgent leaked into the air. A door burst open. A young assistant, cheeks flushed and eyes wide, rushed past Noah, muttering under her breath. The translator didn't show. The Korean delegates are walking out. Her voice was high with panic, and she was already halfway down the hall before Noah could process what she'd said. He turned towards Sophie instinctively, as though sharing a moment of confusion. But Sophie's eyes weren't confused. They were bright, alight with a kind of excitement he'd only ever seen when she figured out a particularly tricky puzzle. She leaned forward, whispering, "Dad, they're speaking Korean." Noah frowned. "You've only been learning that for a few months," he said, half in disbelief. "I understand them," she said with quiet certainty, tugging on his sleeve. "They're talking about leaving because no one can answer their questions." Before he could stop her, she slipped off the chair, her book tumbling shut. "Sophie," he started, but she was already moving toward the boardroom, small hands pushing open the heavy door without hesitation. The boardroom was a different world from the polished but quiet hallway outside. The moment Sophie pushed the door open, the low hum of professional conversation Noah sometimes overheard on his rounds was gone, replaced by sharp, overlapping voices and the faint clink of abandoned coffee cups. A long, gleaming table stretched almost the length of the room, its surface scattered with open folders, stacks of documents, and untouched bottles of mineral water. On one side, 3 Korean businessmen sat stiffly, their expressions tightening with each passing second. On the other, William Crane, the CEO himself, leaned back in his chair, his jaw set in a line that suggested his patience was nearly gone. Several executives hovered nearby, whispering urgently to one another. "Excuse me," Sophie said, her voice tiny but clear in the charged air. "I can help." Heads turned. Crane's eyes, cold and sharp like chips of slate, landed on her. His gaze flicked to Noah in the doorway, mop bucket still beside him. "Who let this kid in?" he demanded. his tone carrying the weight of a man used to having his questions answered immediately. "She's with me," Noah said quickly, stepping forward. He felt the heat of all those eyes shifting toward him, reading him as they always did. The man with the mop, not worth remembering. His instinct was to pull Sophie back out, to apologize and retreat before things got worse. But then, in the brief pause before Crane could dismiss them, one of the Korean delegates spoke sharply, his voice taut with frustration. Though Noah couldn't understand the words, he could hear the finality in the tone, the kind of voice a man used when he was finished talking. Sophie didn't hesitate. She answered in Korean, fluid, measured, and with a rhythm that carried no trace of uncertainty. The words left her mouth like she'd been waiting for them, her tone polite but firm, matching the man's cadence with quiet authority. The room froze. One of the executives blinked, as though doubting what he'd just heard. Crane's brows drew together, his head tilting slightly. The delegate who'd spoken leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing not in suspicion, but in curiosity. "Go on," he said in Korean, this time slower. Sophie listened intently, nodding once before replying. Her small hands folded neatly in front of her, and she didn't glance at Noah for reassurance. She didn't seem to need it. In that moment, Noah felt the strange tension of pride and disbelief tangling together in his chest. He had always known Sophie was bright. He'd seen her devour books, memorize entire passages in foreign tongues just because she liked how the words felt in her mouth. But this, speaking confidently to a table full of strangers in the middle of a high-stakes meeting, was something entirely different. And from the look on Crane's face, it was something he'd never expected either. Sophie's confidence seemed to surprise even herself, but once she began, there was no falter in her voice. She stood at the head of the long table now, a thrift store hoodie hanging loose on her frame, its sleeves pushed up to reveal small, ink-smudged wrists. The faint scent of floor polish followed Noah into the room as he stayed near the doorway, torn between the urge to pull her back and the pull of watching her do something extraordinary. Crane, still seated at the center of the table, was frozen mid-motion, a pen poised in his hand above an untouched notepad. His gaze was fixed on Sophie as though trying to reconcile the image in front of him, a janitor's daughter speaking with the poise of a seasoned interpreter. The Korean delegate who had first challenged the room leaned forward now, his elbows resting on the polished table. "And what do you propose we do about the delay?" he asked, his words slow and deliberate. Sophie nodded, absorbing the question. She turned her head slightly toward Crane and repeated the sentence in flawless English, her tone measured but clear. "He's asking how you intend to resolve the delay without losing both time and face." The phrase "and face" seemed to land with weight in the room, the cultural nuance intact, the meaning sharpened. Crane glanced at one of his vice presidents, who shifted uncomfortably under the sudden expectation. The VP began to speak, fumbling through a vague response, but Sophie's gaze stayed on him with polite patience, ready to carry his words back across the table. When she did, her Korean was smooth, her voice carrying not just the literal meaning but the tone, a mixture of reassurance and firm intent. The Korean side nodded slowly, their tense postures softening by degrees. Minutes stretched into a rhythm. Sophie listened, translated, and mediated with the ease of someone who understood that words were not just tools, but bridges. The conversation began to lose its sharp edges. The Korean delegates leaned back in their chairs more often, their expressions loosening. A small ripple of laughter broke out when Sophie deftly translated a light-hearted remark about New York weather, and the air shifted again, from guarded to collaborative. Noah could hardly believe what he was seeing. She wasn't just speaking the language. She was reading the room, sensing where to push, where to soften, where to pause just long enough to let meaning settle. At one point, Crane caught Noah's eye. There was no dismissiveness there now, no quick judgment about who he was. Instead, there was something closer to disbelief, and perhaps a flicker of respect. By the time the conversation wound down, the Korean chairman's expression had changed entirely. He closed his folder, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The tension that had been ready to detonate when Sophie first walked in was gone. She had done it. The room no longer felt like a battlefield. Sophie's presence had shifted the current. The energy was still alert, but the sharpness had eased into something far more workable. Noah could see it in the way the Korean delegates leaned toward her now, speaking with measured clarity instead of clipped frustration. One of the senior executives on Crane's team began outlining the revised delivery schedule, his tone deliberately steady. Sophie absorbed every word, then turned to the Korean side and spoke in the same unhurried cadence, her voice carrying the weight of professionalism without losing the warmth that had kept the conversation from fraying apart earlier. When she paused, the Korean chairman asked a pointed follow-up, his brows knitting as he sought assurance. Sophie didn't rush. She repeated his question in English exactly as it had been asked. No softening, no spin. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the executive, as if reminding him that this was the moment to be clear. He was. And when Sophie relayed his answer back in Korean, something shifted. The chairman nodded, slowly at first, then with more certainty. From there, the discussion flowed. Numbers were confirmed, minor concessions agreed upon, delivery terms rebalanced in a way that seemed to satisfy both sides. And each time there was the slightest risk of tension creeping back in, Sophie's calm, unbroken rhythm pulled it away. It wasn't just about language. She was holding the meeting together with invisible thread, a thread woven from listening, precision, and the quiet authority of someone who saw no need to dominate the room to influence it. Then came the moment Noah would replay in his mind for years. The Korean chairman leaned back, closed his folder, and let out a small chuckle, the kind that breaks the final layer of formality. The others followed suit, smiles appearing where only minutes ago there had been guarded stares. The chairman turned to Crane and, in careful English, said, "She has a gift. You owe her more than you know." The words seemed to hang in the air, not as flattery, but as fact. Crane, who had been uncharacteristically silent for most of the exchange, inclined his head slightly, though his eyes stayed on Sophie as if still trying to understand exactly what he had just witnessed. Around the table, documents were gathered, pens clicked shut, chairs shifted back. Noah realized, with a mix of awe and pride, that the deal, months of work on the company's part, teetering on the brink of collapse, was not only back on the table, it was essentially done. And it had been saved by a 10-year-old in a worn hoodie who still had soup in a thermos waiting out in the lobby. The boardroom emptied slowly, the echoes of chairs scraping against the floor fading into the muffled hum of the executive hallway. Crane remained seated, his elbows resting on the arms of his leather chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. His gaze was fixed on Sophie, who stood a few paces away, her shoulders finally loosening now that the work was done. For a man known for decisive action, Crane seemed in no hurry to speak. His usual clipped efficiency was gone. Instead, there was a weight to his stillness, as though he was replaying the past half hour in his mind, turning it over from every angle. Sophie glanced toward Noah, seeking only the reassurance of his smile, which he gave without hesitation. She was back to being just his little girl again. No tension in her brow, no need to carry the room. She tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear and let out a small breath, the kind you don't realize you've been holding until the moment is safe. Finally, Crane spoke. His voice was quieter than Noah had ever heard it. "Who is she?" "My daughter," Noah said simply. Crane tilted his head, studying him now in a way that felt different. It wasn't the casual glance of a CEO passing an employee in the hallway. It was deliberate, searching. "Her mother?" he asked. "Her mom was a linguist," Noah replied. "Sophie, she picked up her ear for languages. Studies for fun while I work." He gave a small shrug, as if it were nothing remarkable, though his chest was warm with pride. "Keeps herself busy." Crane's eyes didn't leave Noah's face. It was as if he were seeing him for the first time, not as the man who cleaned floors before dawn, but as someone who had raised a child capable of saving a multi-million-dollar deal without breaking stride. "How long have you been working here?" Crane asked. 3 years. And no one ever noticed her? Noah shook his head. "I didn't think it mattered. She's just Sophie." Crane exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. His expression was unreadable, caught somewhere between disbelief and something softer, something that might have been admiration. For a moment, the room was quiet except for the faint hum of the HVAC, and Noah felt the strange sensation of being weighed and found different. It was in that silence that Crane made up his mind about what would come next. Crane straightened in his chair, the decision already settled in his mind before the words left his mouth. I want to do something for her, he said, his tone carrying the same authority that had once cut short boardroom debates. But this time, there was no sharp edge, just conviction. Noah's instinct was to protest, to wave it off as unnecessary, but Crane didn't give him the chance. She belongs in a place where she can be challenged, where her talent isn't just a curiosity, but an asset. I'll cover a full scholarship to the best private school in the city. And as for you, his eyes fixed on Noah with deliberate weight. We could use someone who knows how to listen and bridge gaps. Client relations. You'd be good at it. You've been doing it in your own way for years. For a moment, Noah could only blink at him. He'd been offered raises before in other jobs, but never a new life. He looked to Sophie, who stood at his side, wide-eyed, clearly unsure if she had heard correctly. Sir, that's, Noah began. Crane cut him off with a small wave of his hand. Not charity. Recognition. You both just proved that genius and connection don't come from titles. They come from the way you carry yourself in a room. Noah felt the truth of it land deep. He extended his hand, and Crane shook it with a firm grip, one that seemed to erase the invisible line between janitor and executive. Months later, the change was visible in ways Noah could still barely believe. Sophie thrived in her new school, where her curiosity was not only encouraged, but matched by mentors and tutors who fed her hunger for knowledge. She learned not just languages, but history, culture, and diplomacy. Her evenings were full of stories about what she'd discovered that day, her voice animated in a way Noah hadn't realized he'd been missing. Noah had traded in his mop for a desk and a suit that fit him well enough to feel unfamiliar at first. The work was different, meetings with clients, helping negotiate partnerships, quietly guiding conversations when they began to drift off course. But in truth, it wasn't so far from what he had always done. Paying attention, reading people, finding the thread that held things together. And now, for the first time in years, he had weekends free to spend entirely with Sophie. At the company's annual gala, Crane took the stage in front of hundreds of guests, the chandeliers casting warm light over the room. Noah and Sophie sat together near the front, both slightly out of place in the glittering crowd, but no longer invisible. Crane told their story without embellishment. The little girl who had walked into a boardroom and saved a deal, the father who had raised her with love and quiet sacrifice. She didn't just save a negotiation, Crane said, his voice carrying easily to the far corners of the room. She reminded us that genius can come from anywhere, and sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truths. Applause filled the hall, warm and sustained. Sophie blushed, ducking her head, but Noah caught the small, proud smile she tried to hide. As they walked home that night, Sophie's hand tucked in his, Noah thought about how quickly life could turn, how a single moment, seized without hesitation, could open doors neither of them had known existed. And he knew, without a doubt, that no matter how far she went, she'd always carry the same gift that had brought her into that boardroom in the first place: the courage to speak up when it mattered most.